Chapter 3. The Swensons' house was south of St. Joseph, on a rise above the Missouri River. The low hills rolled to the west and the north, and the river gleamed beyond them, and the thick woodland crowded to the south and the east edges of the field. Danny's mouth fell open at the sight of a two-story house that rose, gleaming white, at the peak of the highest hill. At each side of the front porch were two tall decorative columns, and he could see a brick chimney rising from the shake roof at each end of the building. Real fireplaces, Danny thought, hunching his shoulders in a happy hug. Back in New York City, he'd sometimes paused in front of one of the elegant houses along the avenues to peer inside before someone saw him and closed the heavy draperies. On cold days, as he'd glimpsed the warm golden and orange flames, he'd wished he could know what it'd be like to sit in front of a cozy fire and be truly warm. Now he would know. The barn was large and to the south of the house, separated by the house by only a double width of the drive, and as they neared the barn, Alfred pulled the horses to a halt. Danny could see the nearby privy and the well beyond the house. Close to the barn was the chicken house, and beyond it, dotting the edge of the recently harvested field, was a row of tall haystacks. The tingling smell of the sun-dried hay blended with the rich, earthy fragrance from the meadows, and Danny breathed it in deeply. Suddenly he caught sight of a vegetable garden. "A real garden?" Danny exclaimed. "I recognize the squash. I've seen squash like that in the markets." Peg's eyes were wide as she stared at what Danny had pointing. "Squash grow on the ground?" she asked, "with those big leaves?" Danny poked her. "Where did you think it grew, on trees?" Peg shrugged and thought for a moment before she solemnly answered, "I've never had a single think about squash." Olga giggled, lifting Peg onto her lap and handing her down to over her lap and handing her down to Alfred. "You may help plant our next garden. Would you like to plant some squash?" Peg ducked her head and hid a mischievous smile. "Oh, yes," she said, "as long as I never have to eat it." Olga took Peg's hand and they laughed as they hurried toward the house. Danny was a little shocked at Peg's ready laughter. Could Peg have forgotten Francis and Megan and Mike and Petey and Ma, especially Ma, so soon that she could be happy without them? "She's only 7, he reminded herself. "You do want her to be happy, don't you?" The answer that flashed in his mind was a grudging yes, but not yet. He squirmed, uncomfortable with his own thoughts. Quickly, as he jumped from the buggy, ready to follow Olga and Peg, Alfred put a hand on his shoulder. "Wouldn't you like to lend a hand with the horses?" "Oh, yes, sir," Danny stammered, embarrassed at his own ignorance, or even worse, that he was appearing ignorant, or even worse, lazy. Alfred patted Danny's shoulder and took a grip on the reins and clucked to the pair of matching brown horses, which were still hitched to the buggy. "You're not used to farm life yet," he said. "I would be just as lost and unknowing as you are right now if I was suddenly set down in New York City." Danny followed behind the buggy, grateful for Alfred's words of kindness. He did feel lost. How was he going to know what he was supposed to do or say? He kept his eyes on Alfred. He liked the way the man walked, with long, purposeful strides. Alfred was not as muscular as Da had been, but he walked just as tall and straight, holding his head high, and he was kind like Da, even though he didn't smile much. Danny tried to reassure himself. "I probably don't need to worry any longer," he thought. "Signs are that Alfred will be a good foster father." At one side of the barn was a section with a buggy. On the other were open stalls for the 3 cows, who turned to stare at Danny, and stalls with half doors for the 2 horses. Danny let out a long whistle and exclaimed, "This is grand!" Alfred unhitched the horses from the buggy, slipped up from the harness from their heads, and held out the leads to Danny. "Suppose you hold Flash and Fury while I open their stalls and fork down some feed." "Flash and Fury?" Danny stammered. The horses snorted, bobbing their heads, and one of them looked right into Danny's eyes. "Don't let the names disturb you," Alfred said. "They're well behaved if treated firmly." Danny reluctantly stepped forward to take the leads, looking up in the faces of the horses. Eager for their stalls and foods, they were restless, blowing gusts of warm air through their noses. "They're fine big animals," Danny said. He gulped as one of the horses leaned down to snort at him with a noise that sounded as loud as an engine of the train. Danny squeezed his eyes shut and held his ground. He thought he heard Alfred chuckle. When he looked over, Alfred's face was solemn as ever. "I'll take him now," Danny said. "Just step back and they won't tread on your toes." With relief, Danny backed up till he could feel a solid post behind him. He watched Alfred rub down the horses with a rough sacking. Soon Alfred stepped from the last stall. "Let's let them enjoy their meal before we give them a full rub down," he said. Pausing, he tilted his head and studied Danny. "You did a good job," he said. Feeling much braver, Danny said, "I can't wait to tell Mike about the horses." The realization hit him like a blow. He wouldn't be seeing Mike to share the story with him, and tears burned his eyes. "Come with me," Alfred said quickly. "I'll show you around the barn and in the yard. Well, your chores will be to help me care for the animals. Tomorrow I'll teach you how to milk a cow." "I'd like to milk a cow," Danny said. Thinking about the warm milk caused his empty stomach to rumble so loudly Alfred heard and turned sharply toward him. "When's the last time you've eaten?" he asked. "A real meal, I mean." "This morning on the train," Danny said. "We had bread and apples and milk." The cookies at the hotel had been delicious, but Danny had been too keyed up and too flustered by the elegant surroundings to do more than nibble. "Not enough to hold you for so long," Alfred said. "Let's take our tour of the farm later. Probably about time for dinner." As they entered the kitchen, Danny knew dinner would be No hurried catch-as-catch canned meal. He inhaled a blend of the light fragrances of cinnamon and sugar and the deep buttery richness of roasting chicken. His mouth watered and he gave a little moan of pleasure. The kitchen was large, warm, and tidy, with rows of cooking tools hanging on the walls and a pine cupboard with dishes and copper pans arranged in rows on its shelf. Centered in the middle of the one inside wall was a huge brick fireplace, both open in the kitchen and a room beyond. Through it, beyond the metal grate and the swinging arm that held a steaming tea kettle, Danny could see the legs of a table and chairs in another room. A red-cheeked woman, strands of brown hair plastered across her damp forehead, her hands swaddling and toweling, pulled a covered dish from a brick oven and turned toward them. She was round as though she were stuffed with pillows, and her smile was comfortable. "So this fine young man's the Danny you were telling me about," she said. Olga put her arm around Danny. "Yes," she answered. "Danny, I'd like you to meet one of our near neighbors, Mrs. Annie Pratka, who was kind enough to come and prepare a meal for us." "Oh, it's no trouble, just a way of being neighborly," Mrs. Pratka insisted. She put down the pan and hugged Danny with such enthusiasm he was nearly smothered. Suddenly released, he staggered back. He saw the mischievous twinkle in Peg's eyes and knew she had received the same overabundant greeting. But Danny's interest lay more in the steaming bowls and the platters of food crowded on the table than Mrs. Pratka. "Wash up, be quick about it," Mrs. Pratka cheerfully ordered. Alfred led Danny to the table in one corner, which were a large bowl, a pitcher of water, a folded towel, and a small bowl of soft lye soap. By the time they'd washed their hands, Mrs. Pratka had lined up Olga and Peg behind her. Olga had a bowl of potatoes, Peg proudly carrying a bowl of applesauce. "Alfred, you carry that large platter of chicken, and Danny, you take the bowl of cream gravy," she said. "Mind you, it's hot, so do be careful not to drop it. I'll come back for the beaten biscuits." Without questions, they all obeyed her, and Danny had a strange sensation of being part of a parade. As they seated themselves, Danny leaned toward the platter of chicken, breathing in the deep fragrance. He closed his eyes, delighted in the moment, but Mrs. Pratka firmly set down the plate of biscuits, plopped in her chair, and said, "Napkins on your laps, children, and bow your heads while Mr. Swenson turns thanks." "Turns what?" Peg asked. Returns thanks to God for all his bounty," Olga murmured, and smiled at Peg. Danny willingly bowed his head, thankful also that Alfred's prayer was short. His stomach rumbled loudly again, and he pressed his hands against it. "Amen," Mrs. Pratka said loudly without pausing for breath. She said, "Fill up your plates, children. There's plenty for seconds and good bread pudding for dessert." Danny ate as if he'd never eaten before. Mrs. Pratka was a little bossy, but she made up for it by being a fine cook. One of the reasons Ma had sent the children west was so they'd have nourishing meals. Danny hoped that Francis, Petey, Mike, and Megan were eating food this good. He paused. The fork loaded with a huge bite of gravy. Smothered biscuit in his hand, suddenly unable to swallow. This wonderful food wasn't worth being parted from the people he loved. He'd give anything to be back home, eating boiled cabbage with Ma and his brothers and sisters. Nothing could take their place. "Danny, you don't like my biscuits?" Mrs. Pratka's voice brought him back to the present. Oh, yes I do," Danny stammered. He couldn't give in to tears, not now. He took a deep breath and tried to smile and said, "You're a fine cook, Mrs. Pratka." He quickly popped a bite on his fork into his mouth. "Then have another biscuit," she said, putting one on his plate and generously spooning cream gravy over it. Tyrus, my late husband, may rest in peace, was always partial to my beaten biscuits." Peg spoke up with a mouthful of food. "What happened to your husband?" Olga gave a little warning frown to Peg. "I'm sorry, Annie," she murmured. But Mrs. Pratka shook her head impatiently and said, "It's a good question. I don't mind answering." She leaned across the table and looked directly at Peg and said, "Tyrus came down with the gripe, and it went right to pneumonia, and he never got better." "Like our da," Peg said. "He was supposed to get better, but he didn't. And I was scared, and we all cried." "Peg," Danny muttered, "that's enough." With one fist he rubbed back his tears, which this time he'd been unable to fight back. Mrs. Pratka shifted her attention to him. "It hurts a lot to lose someone you love," she said. "There's no getting around it, but life goes on, and that's the way it is, so we might as well make the best of it." Danny could hear Ma saying, "And that's the all of it." Same idea. It made sense, and in a way it was such a simple, straightforward advice it made him feel better. He put down his fork, noticing the yard plates were empty too. "I'll clear the table," he said, and scrambled to his feet. Olga rose from her chair. "Thank you, Danny, but there's no need," she said. "Mrs. Pratka and I can manage." "But I want to help," Danny said. Alfred stood and reached for a bowl. "We'll all help," he said. "The more helping hands, the sooner we can get to bread pudding. Do you have cream for it, Olga?" "Of course," she said. "There's a cooled pitcher down in the root cellar." "Not anymore, there isn't." Mrs. Pratka gave a hearty laugh. "It's on the kitchen work table now. I borrowed just a little for my biscuits." Olga laughed with her. Danny was surprised that neither of the Swensons seemed to mind Mrs. Pratka coming into their house and taking over. On the one hand, why would they mind when she cooked such a wonderful meal for them? But on the other, she dominated the conversation, and Danny was desperately curious about Olga and Alfred. This was an entirely new life for him and Peg. With a new home, new parents, new ways of doing things. Frankly, he admitted to himself this part was more frightening than helping Alfred with the horses. As he carried the last empty plate to the kitchen, Mrs. Pratka was still rattling on. "And oh, wasn't Tyrus the one to save every little thing?" She pointed to a huge ball of twine on the shelf near the back door. "He would have greatly admired your thriftiness, Olga." What is that thing? Peg asked, looking to where Mrs. Pratt had pointed. Olga's one folly but harmless one, Alfred said. He tenderly put his arm around his wife's shoulders. Olga tossed her head, pretending to be miffed, but said, I just can't help. I can't abide to throw away the good, sturdy pieces of twine that tie the feed sacks and purchased from the store. Who knows when they'll come in handy? She ties them together, Alfred explained to Danny and Peg, winds them into a ball. We expect it to grow bigger and bigger till it takes up the entire kitchen. Then we'll have to do our cooking outdoors. Oh, Alfred, Olga said with a giggle. Enough of your teasing. Who's going to dish up the bread pudding? By the time the meal was over, the kitchen cleaned, and they said their goodbyes to Mrs. Pratka. Danny was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. But Olga gave Danny and Peg a tour of the house, and Alfred showed them around the farm. That evening, the fireplace in the dining room was comforting, the flames casting shadows that jumped in and out of the dark corners of the room. Danny spooned in the hot beef soup Olga had served them, hoping he wouldn't fall asleep at the table. Even Peg's chatter had come to a halt. Peg dropped her spoon with a clatter. I'm so tired, she murmured. Of course you are, dear, Olga said, and immediately got up to help Peg from her chair. I'll take you upstairs right now, tuck you into bed. Better take Danny, too, Alfred said. He's about ready to turn that soup plate into a pillow. Danny pulled himself up in his chair. I'll help with the dishes, he said. Not tonight, Alfred said firmly. It's up to bed with you. Your room is next to Peg's. Can't Danny sleep with me? Peg asked. At home, all the children had shared the same bed. From now on, you and Danny will have your own rooms, Alfred told her. Peg's lower lip quivered. Alfred picked her up and swung her over his shoulder. She's overtired, he said to Olga. She'll be asleep by the time her head touches the pillow. Olga picked up a lamp and went ahead of them up the stairs. She lit the lamp in Danny's room, kissed him softly on the forehead. Good night, Danny. Sleep well, she said. There's water in the basin, so you can wash. I put your clothes in the chest. Your nightshirt's on top, so if there's anything you need, call us. Danny nodded, glad when the door closed behind her. As quickly as he could manage, he pulled off his clothes, tugged on his nightshirt, and dove under the quilt on his bed. He saved the washing up for some other time. He heard footsteps going down the stairs, and Alfred and Olga's voices murmuring together. And then the silence through the wall of his room, he heard Peg crying. Peg, he said. Peg, can you hear me? There was a snuffling whisper and a creak in her bed before she answered, Yes. Stop crying. It won't help. You've got to go to sleep. But I'm lonely. You won't be lonely if you're asleep. Danny's eyelids were so heavy they ached. Come and sleep with me, Danny, Peg begged. I can't. We're supposed to sleep in our own rooms. Peg began to cry softly again. I miss Ma, she moaned. I miss Francis and Megan. Danny struggled to sit up. Be quiet. They'll hear you downstairs. He waited a minute, but Peg's sobs didn't stop. All right. I'm coming, he groaned. He slid from the bed, wincing as his feet hit the cold plank floor. Danny stealthily opened his door. There was enough light coming down from the hall downstairs so he could find his way to Peg's room. He opened the door and shut it just as quietly, stifling a cry as he stubbed his toe against the end of her bed. Peg scrambled up to cling to him. Get back in bed, he ordered. Danny squirmed from one position to another, trying to get comfortable in her bed. I can't sleep here, complained. The bed's too narrow. Well, don't leave me, Peg insisted. We can put the quilt off the bed and sleep on the floor. Don't be silly, Danny said. Here, I'll curl up next to your feet. Just don't kick. He tugged the bottom of the quilt over him. I won't. I promise, Peg whispered. You always do, Danny mumbled. I do not, he heard Peg say. If she said anything else, he missed it. As with a sigh, he dropped immediately into sleep. Later, mixed with the dreams that murmured through his mind, Danny felt a pair of strong arms lift him in the pillow, his head against a hard shoulder. Da, he whispered. Danny could picture his father smiling, nestling his chin against Danny's curly hair. Da, he said again. I'm here, a deep voice whispered. Go to sleep. Everything's all right. Danny could feel himself being tucked into bed, the quilt snuggled under his chin, and a rough hand stroking back the hair from his forehead. He heard the door shut and slid back into his dreams.